Well, I want to thank President Chop for that incredibly gracious introduction. My wife, who's over there, will now come forward to give the rebuttal. If she doesn't, the Court of Appeals will. So when one reaches a certain age, whether it's 150 years for Swarthmore College or a measly 70 years for myself, one feels free to speak from the heart. And so I hope it won't sound trite when I say from my heart that I really, really love this college, and I know you do too. What this college has given us is a sense of purpose. For most people, a college education is simply a tool for personal advancement. To some, it is an introduction to new and challenging ideas. But at Swarthmore, we are taught to value intellectual rigor only so that we would be better fit to contribute to social benefit. This, of course, is what's called the Quaker Tradition. Something, frankly, that I was largely oblivious to when I was a student here 50 years ago. The college, after all, is composed overwhelmingly of non-Quakers, and those few who are members of the Society of Friends and who have every reason to be so proud of the glorious Quaker tradition tend to keep their pride in their hearts, but not to wear it on their sleeves. When I was at Swarthmore, I thought the Quaker tradition consisted largely of the slogan that we used to cheer at football games. You all remember football games, yes? The cheer was, "Kill Quakers, kill." But now I know better. To the brave Hicksite Quakers who founded this college in the midst of the Civil War, no less, their purpose was to help their children, as they said, mind the light. That is, to find and fan the spark of the divine buried deep in every individual so that it would burst forth with lives that speak through precept and example. And there has never been a time in the succeeding 150 years when that linkage of intellectual toughness and social consciousness has not permeated this college or failed to provide its alumni with a sense that in ways small or large, heralded or unheralded, we can fulfill that mission. So I say that it is you who are the Quaker tradition, and you have every reason to be proud of it. I worry, though, that some of us, myself included, may sometimes depart from that tradition and wear our sense of moral rectitude too much on our sleeves, that we may consciously or unconsciously affect a kind of arrogance that we know what is right or wrong, even if others are blind. On a day when we are remembering a century and a half of history, it is well to remember how many beliefs that were held by educated men and women just a few decades ago strike us now as misguided or even absurd. To give just one example, even in the early 1960s when I was at Swarthmore, people who thought of themselves as enlightened regarded homosexuality not as a sin, to be sure, but as a psychological disorder that could and should be rectified by psychiatric treatment. This indeed was the official position of the American Psychiatric Association from 1952 until 1980. Is it not likely that some of our current enlightened beliefs will someday be regarded as examples of ignorance and closed-mindedness? If Swarthmore has taught us anything, it is that we must be ever watchful that our social consciousness is indeed the product of rigorous and continuing intellectual scrutiny, and not just passionate feelings or personal preferences. This requires an open mind, a respect for free speech, and a tolerance for diversity of ideas. To me, one of the most telling examples of what Swarthmore stands for occurred toward the end of my sophomore year when a student group called SPAC, I think there are a few of their members here today, invited Gus Hall to speak on campus. Now, Gus Hall was the longtime chairman of the Communist Party USA. He was a convicted felon, and to his shame, he was an apologist, an unswerving apologist for the atrocities of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was still in full force, and the college was subjected to intense outside criticism for permitting him to speak. After all, the argument went, even free speech has its limits, and to permit the college's facilities to be used as a forum for rhetoric by a supporter of a tyrannic government that had murdered millions of people and enslaved millions more was simply beyond the pale. But President Courtney Smith, a man I think had immense personal integrity, would have none of it. Though he unquestionably detested Hall, he made no self-serving statements to that effect, but rather met Hall at the train station, escorted him on campus, and then the next day issued a short statement that read in pertinent part, "We are not afraid of freedom. We have faith in the validity and strength of our Constitution. We have faith that our students will not buy any wooden nickels." In contrast to that heroic stance, let me describe the scene a few years later at Harvard when I was then a law student. It was 1968, and the student sentiment against the Vietnam War was at its peak, and the university agreed to hold a forum in Harvard Yard to which both pro-war and anti-war speakers were invited. But as soon as the first pro-war speaker began to speak, the anti-war students in the audience began to yell "murderer" and other nasty names, and this continued without interruption for many minutes, effectively preventing him from speaking at all. Although I was personally against the war in Vietnam, I was frankly appalled by what I saw there that day. And what really struck me was the fact that the numerous faculty members who were present, both on the dais and in the audience, made not the slightest attempt to quiet the crowd. It seemed obvious that, to them at least, free speech at Harvard was simply a slogan, not something worth fighting for. Now, I offer these reminiscences because it seems to me that even though it is often people with axes to grind who claim that free speech and diversity of thought are being curtailed in many colleges and universities today, there is some evidence that in some instances they are right. For example, all too many colleges and universities have codes of student conduct so stringent that they effectively discourage politically incorrect discourse. Yet, while going so far as to inhibit even harmless dirty jokes on the ground that they might constitute sexual harassment, many colleges and universities do little, for example, to effectively combat binge drinking, which unquestionably contributes to campus sexual assault. The moral appears to be, let's ban bad words, but do little to prevent bad deeds, exactly the opposite of what the U.S. Constitution contemplates. More generally, too many colleges appear to be devoted to every kind of diversity except the one kind of diversity that is most central to their function, the diversity of ideas and opinions. Most recently, as you heard this morning, and many of you are aware, commencement speakers at several prestigious universities either withdrew their appearances or in one case were disinvited by the institution itself in response to student protests. Although some commentators have severely chastised the students, I think the problem is more complicated and more diffuse. The students who simply protested the invitations were fairly exercising their own right of free speech. On the other hand, those much smaller number of students who threatened to go further and actually disrupt the speakers if the speakers came and spoke showed their ignorance of the fundamental prerequisite to all free inquiry, namely a respect for the right of others to be heard. As for the speakers who withdrew, while one can well understand their reluctance to become embroiled in controversy, one might have hoped that they might have given more weight to the pedagogical benefits of their coming to speak in the face of protests and thereby reinforcing the right of free speech. After all, these were public figures used to giving as good as they got in the war of ideas. In Harry Truman's famous words, if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. Lastly, well, it appears that with the exception of Brandeis, the other institutions involved in these situations, Rutgers, Smith, and yes, Haverford, did their best to try to convince the speakers not to withdraw. One has to wonder whether they were reaping the harvests of their more general promotion of correct speech at the cost of free speech. Our terrific, wonderful president, Rebecca Chopp, put her finger on this problem last summer and again this morning when, after a series of incidents culminating in the withdrawal of Robert Zellick as commencement honorary, she issued a strong statement expressing her own disappointment in, quote, our failure this spring to support at each and every moment both the expression and the protection of all forms of speech. That is exactly the point. The expression and the protection of all forms of speech. For without that protection, that is, without a decent respect for the opinions of others and a determination to allow them to be heard, our vaunted free speech is nothing but a sham. There is no institution to which unfettered free speech is more important than Swarthmore College. And that is because the Quaker tradition, the transmutation of intellectual rigor into socially conscious behavior, only works when one is open to a wide range of ideas and then applies to all these ideas the same tough intellectual scrutiny. Moreover, both the concept of free speech and the Quaker tradition are grounded in an optimistic faith in the ability of people of goodwill to find that spark of the divine in themselves and build a better future. No Swarthmore class is more aware of this than my own class, the centennial class of 1964, for we were students and often active participants when the civil rights movement really took hold, when the war on poverty began to be fought, when discrimination on grounds of gender was first banned, and much more. We had much cause for optimism, but also some cause for pessimism. The murder of civil rights workers in Mississippi, the assassination of President Kennedy, the growing involvement in Vietnam, and again, much more. We were in almost a constant state of ferment. Yet, in those magical moments when sitting on parish lawn in the quiet of the evening, our world for just a moment stood still, we knew that we could overcome. At the end of every reunion collection, it is customary to sing the Swarthmore alma mater song, a rather insipid song, actually. But we will get to that in a minute. But for my class, and perhaps for all of the classes here, the song that really expressed what we took from Swarthmore was the civil rights anthem, We Shall Overcome. So I'm going to ask three of my classmates, Peggy Colvin, Sue Slade, and Mike Mirapold, to come on up And then I would ask all of you to join hands, stand up, and sing with us, "We Shall Overcome." Thank you.
We shall live in peace.
We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I know that I do believe we shall live in peace someday.
Great. We'll walk hand in hand.
We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I know that I do believe we shall overcome someday.
One more time.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I know that I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Now, it's something of an anticlimax, but we do have to sing the Swarthmore alma mater. But thanks to Mike Mirapol, who, by the way, is I think, the born successor to Pete Seeger, we're going to sing it in bluegrass style. So.
Hey, let's get close to the mic as we can.
Yes, 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 yes.
Staunch and great thou standst before us on the campus fair. Thy high spirit's guarding o'er us, who thy blessings share. Thee we praise with songs of gladness, name like glory's o'er. Hail to thee, our alma mater, hail, all hail Swarthmore. Though we leave thee and though sorrow, still our laughter gay. cherish memories borrowed from the past so great. Then you'll hear the old grads singing as in days of yore. Hail to thee, our alma mater. Hail, all hail, Swarth. Do that one last line again. Hail to thee, our alma mater. Hail, all hail, Swarthmore.